Life has a way of lulling you into complacency. After 10 years of marriage, I thought our life was stable, built on a foundation that no storm could shake. Emily, my wife, worked as a marketing director for a thriving tech startup. I managed a small family-owned bookstore, a quaint, quiet space that had become my sanctuary. We weren't perfect, but we were a team, or so I thought. Lately, though, Emily had started mentioning her boss, Nathan, in conversations. It was subtle at first, praise for his leadership, anecdotes about his strategic vision. I didn't think much of it. Emily was passionate about her work, and Nathan seemed to bring out the best in her. But as the weeks went by, her stories about him became more frequent, her enthusiasm more vibrant. Then came the late nights. "We're launching a major campaign," she explained, her words hurried but believable. "There's so much at stake. I'll be late again tonight." I nodded, offering my support without hesitation. She was ambitious. That drive was one of the things I admired most about her. But admiration started giving way to unease when the late nights turned into entire weekends. It wasn't just the hours that changed. Emily did too. She became more distant, her once warm and easy demeanor replaced by sharp edges. Conversations felt strained, as if she was treading water in a sea of her own making. I told myself it was stress, that it would pass once the campaign launched. I had to believe that. Trust was the bedrock of our relationship, wasn't it? One evening, she came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed and her smile distant. "Nathan's hosting a team dinner next Friday," she said, her voice casual. "It's just to unwind, nothing serious." "That sounds nice," I replied, though something about her tone felt rehearsed. Her eyes didn't quite meet mine, and the unease I'd been trying to ignore churned like a storm on the horizon. The next morning, while she rushed to leave for work, I noticed her phone on the counter. It was locked, though it hadn't been before. When did that change? Questions began to pile up like unsteady bricks, but I kept my silence. Later that week, I decided to surprise her at the office. She'd forgotten her lunch, a detail she'd usually obsess over. I thought it might remind her of the simpler times when little gestures meant everything. When I arrived, the receptionist gave me a strained smile. "Emily isn't here right now. She left with Mr. Harding about an hour ago." "Nathan." My chest tightened. "Did they mention where they were going?" The receptionist hesitated. "I believe they said something about his place, brainstorming for the campaign." I thanked her, my voice stiff but polite, and walked back to my car. My mind raced as I sat behind the wheel. Brainstorming sessions don't typically happen at a boss's house, do they? Still, I pushed the thought aside, convincing myself I was overreacting. Emily was my wife. She deserved the benefit of the doubt. But doubt, once planted, has a way of growing roots. The days following Emily's office brainstorming incident felt like walking through quicksand. Every glance, every word exchanged between us seemed heavier, loaded with meanings I couldn't decipher. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my imagination was crafting scenarios far worse than reality. But the knot in my stomach told a different story. The following Friday, the day of Nathan's team dinner, Emily spent hours getting ready. She emerged from the bathroom in a sleek black dress I hadn't seen in years, her makeup carefully done, her perfume a subtle mix of lavender and spice. She looked beautiful, radiant even, but her expression was distant. "You look amazing," I said, trying to mask the unease that churned within me. "Thanks," she replied with a quick smile. "Don't wait up for me. It might run late." "Sure," I said, my voice more neutral than I intended. She kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her bag, and left. The silence that followed was deafening. I told myself to trust her, to give her space, but trust felt more like an illusion with every passing hour. By midnight, she still wasn't home. By 1 in the morning, I found myself pacing the living room. The logical part of me said to let it go, but the gnawing suspicion wouldn't let me rest. I grabbed my keys and drove toward Nathan's address, a detail I gleaned during idle conversations when Emily had gushed about his chic, minimalist home. When I arrived, my heart sank. Her car was parked outside, nestled comfortably in the driveway. The lights in the house were dim, but through the sheer curtains, I could make out shadows moving inside. 2 figures. Close. Too close. I sat there for what felt like hours, torn between confronting her and fleeing from the truth. I'd never felt so powerless, so betrayed. Finally, I drove home, my mind a tempest of doubt and anger. She returned around 3 a.m. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and the faint scent of Nathan's cologne clung to her clothes. "How was the dinner?" I asked, keeping my tone casual despite the storm brewing inside me. "It was fine," she said, brushing past me and heading upstairs. No details, no elaboration, just a clipped response that left me feeling more hollow than before. The following day, I couldn't shake the image of her car in Nathan's driveway. I needed clarity, something more concrete than the whispers of suspicion haunting me. While Emily showered, I unlocked her laptop, hoping for answers. Her calendar was open, filled with cryptic entries. NH meeting, client dinner, private NH strategy session. Each one felt like a slap in the face. Then, in her email drafts folder, I found it, a half-written message to Nathan. "I can't keep doing this, Nathan. It's too risky. Alex is starting to notice, and I hate lying to him. But every time I think about stopping, The draft ended there. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen. She hadn't sent it, but the words were enough to confirm what I'd feared. Whatever this was between them, it wasn't just professional. When Emily came downstairs later that morning, I forced a smile and asked, "What's the plan for today?" She hesitated, as if trying to gauge my mood. "Just errands," she said. "Nothing exciting. Need company?" I offered, hoping to catch her off guard. "No, that's okay," she said quickly, her eyes flicking away. "I won't be long." As she left, I felt the walls of my world start to close in. The woman I thought I knew, the life I believed we shared, it all felt like a fragile illusion, one that was shattering with every passing moment. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more. Something undeniable. I needed the truth. Over the next week, I tried to act normal, but my mind was anything but calm. Every time Emily smiled at me, "I love you," she murmured felt like a lie, a carefully crafted script. The weight of her draft email, the late nights, and the evasive behavior made it impossible for me to see her the same way. But I still couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed proof that couldn't be denied or twisted. One evening, as she showered, I went through her work bag. It felt wrong, invasive, but I reminded myself that she'd already broken our trust. Tucked between folders and printed reports, I found a receipt from an upscale hotel downtown. The date matched the night of Nathan's dinner. My breath caught as I examined the details. A suite booked for 2. It wasn't confirmation of anything physical, but it was enough to feel like another knife in my chest. "Alex?" Emily's voice drifted down the hall. I quickly slid the receipt back into her bag and closed it. "In the living room," I called, trying to steady my voice. She entered moments later, her hair damp and her face fresh from the shower. "What are you watching?" she asked, glancing at the muted TV. "Just flipping through channels," I replied casually, though my pulse pounded in my ears. "How was work today?" She hesitated briefly. "Busy. Nathan's been putting a lot of pressure on us to meet deadlines." There it was again, his name, delivered with that mix of admiration and nonchalance. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "He seems like a demanding boss." She shrugged. "He just wants things done right." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as she slept peacefully beside me. The receipt, the draft email, and her increasing distance painted a picture I didn't want to believe. But denial wouldn't help me anymore. I needed help. The next morning, I reached out to Liam, a private investigator I'd worked with years ago when my bookstore was dealing with theft. He was discreet and thorough, exactly what I needed now. "Alex, it's been a while," Liam said when we met at a quiet cafe on the other side of town. "What's going on?" "It's Emily," I admitted, the words bitter in my mouth. "I think she's involved with someone. Her boss." Liam's expression didn't waver. He leaned forward, his voice calm and professional. "What do you need from me?" "Evidence," I said firmly. "Something undeniable." Liam nodded. "I'll start with surveillance. Work schedules, whereabouts, and any unusual activity. Give me her usual routine and Nathan's full name." I handed him the information and returned home, a mixture of guilt and determination swirling in my chest. Was this betrayal? Or was it self-preservation? The first update came 3 days later. Liam called me late in the evening, his voice clipped but steady. "She's meeting him at the hotel again," he said. "I've got pictures of them entering a suite together. No assistants, no team members, just the two of them." The knot in my stomach tightened. "And after that?" "They stayed for 3 hours. She left first, and he followed about 20 minutes later." It felt like my world was crumbling. This was no longer a suspicion. It was a reality I couldn't escape. I thanked Liam and hung up, my hands trembling. Emily returned home later that night, claiming another late meeting. I watched her closely as she moved around the kitchen, chatting about her day. She seemed at ease, her smile radiant, her tone light. It was almost insulting how easily she wove her lies, as though I were too blind to see the truth. "Everything okay?" she asked, catching me staring. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She didn't press further, and I was grateful. I couldn't afford to tip my hand, not yet. By the end of the week, Liam had gathered enough evidence to paint a damning picture. Photographs of Emily and Nathan at the hotel, text messages they exchanged, and even a recording of them laughing in a quiet corner of a restaurant. "She's not hiding it as well as she thinks," Liam said when he handed me the file. "It's all here." I stared at the folder, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. Seeing it laid out so clearly, the dates, the places, the lies, felt like a physical blow. My wife, the woman I had loved and trusted for years, had built an entire life behind my back. It wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal of everything we had built together. I closed the folder, my chest tightening with a mix of heartbreak and fury. "Thank you, Liam," I said quietly. "Let me know if you need anything else," he replied, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. I nodded, but I already knew what I needed to do. The confrontation was coming, and this time, Emily wouldn't be able to deny the truth. That weekend, Emily's behavior shifted. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe she sensed my growing distance. She seemed more attentive, going out of her way to make small gestures, bringing me coffee in the morning, asking about my day, even suggesting we have dinner together at our favorite restaurant. But to me, it all felt hollow, like she was trying to patch a leaking ship while ignoring the gaping hole in the hull. I played along, masking the resentment that bubbled just beneath the surface. I needed her to feel secure, to believe that I was still blind to her deception. It was the only way to ensure that when the truth came crashing down, she wouldn't have time to spin her lies. On Monday, she mentioned another late meeting, this time on Wednesday night. "We're finalizing the new campaign," she said over breakfast, her tone casual. Nathan wants to go over everything with the core team. I nodded, pretending not to care. Makes sense, I said, sipping my coffee. Inside, I was seething. I already knew the truth. Liam's report had included a detailed schedule of her secret rendezvous. Wednesday wasn't about work, it was another night at the hotel. That evening, I sat in the living room, staring at the folder Liam had given me. The pictures, the texts, the receipts, it was all there, a testament to the life Emily was living outside of our marriage. I replayed the conversations in my head, the little lies she told, the times I trusted her without question. Each memory felt like a dagger, twisting deeper with every revelation. But I wasn't just angry, I was determined. This wasn't going to be another passive moment in my life. I was done being the trusting husband, the one who turned a blind eye. This time, I would take control. Wednesday came faster than I expected. Emily left the house dressed impeccably, her makeup flawless, her hair styled. "Don't wait up," she said with a smile, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. I forced myself to return the smile. "Have a good night." The moment her car disappeared down the street, I sprang into action. I grabbed the folder and the small recording device I'd hidden in her purse earlier that morning. I didn't know if it would capture anything incriminating, but I wasn't leaving anything to chance. Then I drove to the hotel. Liam had already confirmed the suite number, and I parked a safe distance away, watching from the shadows as her car pulled into the lot. Minutes later, Nathan arrived. They entered the building together, laughing like old friends sharing a secret. I waited, my heart pounding. Time dragged, every second stretching into an eternity. The lights in their suite stayed on, a glaring reminder of what was happening inside. When they finally left, I followed at a distance, keeping my headlights dim. Emily dropped Nathan off at his car and drove home, her face serene as if nothing had happened. I arrived minutes after her, entering the house with the folder in hand. She was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Hey," she said with a smile. "You're up late." I set the folder on the counter with a loud thud. Her smile faltered. "What's that?" she asked, her voice wary. "Open it," I said, my tone colder than I intended. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder before finally flipping it open. As her eyes scanned the contents, her face drained of color. The pictures, the texts, the receipts, they all stared back at her like ghosts of her betrayal. "Alex, I can explain," she stammered, looking up at me with wide, panicked eyes. "Explain what?" I snapped. "The hotel receipts? The texts? The fact that you've been lying to my face for months?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "It wasn't what you think," she whispered. "Nathan and I—" "Don't," I interrupted, slamming my hand on the counter. "Don't you dare insult me with more lies." She flinched, her tears spilling over as she crumpled into a chair. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she sobbed. "It was a mistake, a stupid, terrible mistake." I stared at her, the woman I had loved and trusted for a decade, now a stranger. "You didn't mean for this to happen?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You didn't mean to book hotel rooms? You didn't mean to spend hours texting him while I was sitting here like a fool?" Her sobs grew louder, but I couldn't stop. The anger, the betrayal, the months of suspicion, it all poured out in a torrent. "You destroyed us, Emily. You destroyed everything we built together. For what? For him?" She tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away, the gesture feeling like a mockery. "Is it over?" I demanded, my voice sharp. "Or are you still sneaking around behind my back?" "It's over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I ended it. I swear." I didn't believe her. Not fully. And even if it was true, it didn't change what she'd done. "Pack a bag," I said, my voice cold and detached. "What?" she asked, her head snapping up. "You heard me. Pack a bag and leave." Her eyes widened in shock. "Alex, please. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through it." "No," I said firmly. "There's no fixing this. Not after what you've done." She didn't argue further. Slowly, shakily, she rose from the chair and disappeared upstairs. I listened to the sounds of drawers opening and closing, the faint rustle of fabric, and the creak of her suitcase wheels on the floor. When she returned, she stood in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't respond. I couldn't. As she walked out the door, the weight of her betrayal settled over me like a heavy fog. The life we had built was gone, shattered by her choices. And while I felt like I was drowning in the wreckage, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let her destroy me. The silence in the house was suffocating after Emily left. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator felt amplified, echoing in the hollow space she used to fill. Her scent lingered faintly in the air, a cruel reminder of the life we'd once shared. But the betrayal that hung over it all soured any fond memories. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the folder Liam had given me. The evidence of her lies, her choices, was now my armor. I wasn't going to let her take anything more from me. The next morning, I made my first call to a lawyer. Sylvia O'Connor had a reputation for being sharp, ruthless, and efficient. She answered on the second ring, her tone professional but approachable. "Mr. Garrett," she began after I explained my situation, "I'll need to review the evidence you've gathered and assess your financial arrangements. If you're ready to proceed, we can ensure this divorce works in your favor." "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. Sylvia's next question hit harder than I expected. "Do you have a prenuptial agreement?" "We do," I replied, thinking back to the early days of our marriage when such an agreement had felt like a mere formality. Now it felt like a lifeline. "Good," she said. "Send me the details, along with any financial records and the evidence of infidelity. I'll take it from there." As I ended the call, a grim sense of purpose settled over me. This wasn't just about ending my marriage. It was about reclaiming my life. In the days that followed, I threw myself into preparing for the legal battle. I transferred funds from our joint accounts into my personal one, ensuring Emily wouldn't have access to drain them. I changed passwords, updated accounts, and even contacted a locksmith to rekey the house. The work was methodical, almost therapeutic. It gave me something to focus on besides the ache in my chest. Emily called a few times, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and pleas. "Alex, please just talk to me," she begged in one message. "We can fix this. I made a mistake, but I love you. Doesn't that count for something?" I didn't answer. What was there to say? Her actions had spoken louder than any apology could. By the end of the week, Sylvia had filed the divorce papers. "We've also filed a motion to freeze any remaining joint assets," she told me during a follow-up call. "And based on the prenuptial agreement, she won't be entitled to much. The evidence of her affair solidifies your position." Hearing those words should have felt like a victory, but all I felt was exhaustion. The battle was just beginning, and while I was prepared to fight, the emotional toll was heavier than I anticipated. As the legal process unfolded, I began to confront the other remnants of my marriage. The house was filled with Emily's things: clothes, books, pictures from vacations we'd taken together. I started boxing them up, one room at a time. In the corner of our bedroom, I found a small photo album she'd put together years ago. It was filled with moments of happiness: our wedding day, trips to the mountains, lazy Sunday mornings when we'd made pancakes and laughed about nothing. For a moment, I felt the weight of grief pressing down on me. This was the life I thought I'd have forever, and now it was gone. But then I remembered the texts, the hotel receipts, the lies. That grief turned to anger, and I closed the album, tossing it into the donation pile without a second glance. 2 weeks after she left, Emily showed up at the house unannounced. She looked different, haggard, her usual polished appearance replaced with tired eyes and a disheveled demeanor. "Alex," she said, her voice trembling, "can we talk?" I leaned against the doorframe, keeping the door partially closed. "There's nothing left to say, Emily. Please," she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I messed up. I know I did. But I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Counseling, therapy, anything. You had months to think about that," I said coldly. "You didn't just mess up, Emily. You made choices. Deliberate ones. And now you have to live with them." Her tears fell freely now, but I didn't soften. She cried before, lied before. I wasn't falling for it again. "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't get to say that," I replied, my tone like ice. "Not after what you've done." For a moment, she looked like she might say something else, but then she nodded, defeated. "I'll go," she said quietly. She turned and walked down the driveway, her shoulders slumped. I closed the door and locked it, the sound of the bolts sliding into place a small comfort. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of peace. This was the beginning of my new life, one without Emily, one where I could rebuild on my own terms. After Emily's visit, I felt a strange sense of calm. Her attempts to reconcile, to worm her way back into my life, had failed. She was out of the house, out of my daily routine, and for the first time in years I could breathe. But I wasn't done yet. Nathan, the man who had invaded my life and stolen my wife, had gone unscathed. That didn't sit right with me. He deserved to face the consequences of his actions, just as Emily did. I reached out to Liam again. "I need information on Nathan," I told him. "What kind of information?" "Everything. His family, his career, anything that can be used to expose what he's done." Liam didn't ask questions. He just nodded and got to work. The report Liam delivered a week later was more thorough than I expected. Nathan was married, with 2 young kids, and a wife named Lisa who worked as a nurse. His professional record was spotless, but there were cracks beneath the surface. "He's had affairs before," Liam explained. 2 women from his previous job. He was never reported, but there are whispers in his industry. This isn't new territory for him." I stared at the file, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "What about his wife? Does she know?" "Doubtful," Liam said. "But you could change that." I debated whether to contact Lisa. It felt cruel to shatter someone else's life, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized she deserved the truth, just as I had. I called her late one evening, when I knew Nathan would still be at the office. Her voice was hesitant when she answered. "Hello? Lisa?" I began, my voice steady. "You don't know me, but I'm Alex Garrett. I'm calling about your husband." There was a long pause. "What about him?" she asked, her voice tight. "I think you should know that Nathan has been having an affair with my wife, Emily," I said, my tone careful but firm. Her breath hitched on the other end of the line. "How do you know this?" "I have evidence," I replied. "Photographs, messages, hotel receipts. If you'd like, I can send them to you." Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was trembling. "Send them." I set the file and waited in silence, the minutes dragging by like hours. When she called back, her tone had shifted, no longer hesitant, but sharp with anger. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'll handle this." And handle it she did. A few days later, word spread through Emily's company that Nathan had been publicly confronted by his wife. Lisa had marched into his office during a meeting, slammed the evidence on the table, and demanded answers in front of his team. The fallout was immediate. The company launched an investigation into Nathan's conduct, and within a week, he was forced to resign. His once pristine reputation was in tatters, and his family life was in ruins. It wasn't the kind of revenge I'd planned, but it was satisfying nonetheless. With Nathan out of the picture, I turned my focus back to the divorce. Sylvia had been relentless, ensuring Emily walked away with as little as possible. The court proceedings were grueling, every detail of our marriage laid bare for strangers to dissect. But when the final ruling came, it was worth it. The house was mine, along with the majority of our shared assets. Emily was denied alimony, and her attempts to challenge the prenuptial agreement were dismissed. Watching her sign the final papers was a bittersweet moment. She looked defeated, a shadow of the confident woman I'd once married. "Goodbye, Emily," I said as I left the courtroom. She didn't respond. In the weeks that followed, I worked to rebuild my life. I threw myself into the bookstore, expanding its online presence and hosting community events. It became my sanctuary, a place where I could focus on something meaningful. I also started therapy, something I'd been hesitant about at first. Talking through the betrayal, the anger, and the heartbreak helped more than I expected. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again. Emily tried to contact me a few times, leaving voicemails and sending messages filled with apologies and pleas. I didn't respond. There was no point. I had nothing left to say to her. One evening, as I was packing up the bookstore, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the local hospital, thanking me for a donation I'd made in Emily's name, a gesture of closure. It wasn't much, but it felt right. As I locked the door and stepped into the cool night air, I realized something. I was free. Free from the lies, the pain, and the weight of a marriage that had been crumbling long before I'd noticed the cracks. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, I felt hopeful. In the months after the divorce, life settled into an unfamiliar rhythm. At first, the quietness of the house was oppressive. Without Emily, it felt like I was living in someone else's space, a museum of memories I no longer wanted to visit. I tackled the problem the only way I knew how, by removing every trace of her. Her clothes, her books, the little trinkets she had scattered throughout the house, all of it was boxed up and donated or thrown away. I even repainted the walls and replaced the bedroom furniture. It was expensive, but it was necessary. The transformation wasn't just physical. It felt like shedding a layer of skin, like reclaiming my home and, in a way, myself. Work became my refuge. I poured my energy into the bookstore, expanding its reach online and organizing events to draw in the community. Author signings, poetry readings, and even a monthly book club breathed new life into the shop. One day, during a particularly busy weekend event, a woman lingered near the new arrivals section. She was tall, with auburn hair and a warm smile. I noticed her flipping through a book and offered to help. "Looking for something specific?" I asked, trying not to sound too eager. She looked up, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "Just browsing. This place is amazing. I didn't know it existed until a friend mentioned it." "Well, welcome," I said, handing her a flyer for our upcoming book club. "We're always happy to see new faces." She introduced herself as Claire, a teacher who had recently moved to the area. We talked for a while, and before she left, she promised to come back for the book club meeting. Something about her felt different, calm, genuine. It wasn't a spark, exactly, but a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. In the evenings, I often thought about Emily. Not with anger, but with a strange sense of detachment. I wondered how her life had turned out since the divorce. I knew her relationship with Nathan had fallen apart. Liam had mentioned it during one of our last conversations. She'd struggled to find stable work, her reputation tarnished by the affair and its fallout. I didn't take pleasure in her misfortune, but I couldn't deny a sense of vindication. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. One night, while clearing out the attic, I found an old photo of us from our honeymoon. We were standing on a beach, smiling at the camera with the kind of ease that comes from believing you have your whole life ahead of you. I stared at it for a long time before placing it in the donation box. I didn't need to keep reminders of a past that no longer served me. Claire returned for the book club meeting, just as she'd promised. She fit in effortlessly, laughing and chatting with the other members. After the meeting, she lingered, helping me stack chairs and clean up. "Do you ever get tired of being surrounded by books?" she asked, glancing around the store. "Never," I said with a smile. "They're better company than most people." She laughed, a sound that was light and genuine. "I can see that." We talked for a while longer, and when she left, I realized I was smiling. Over the next few months, Claire and I grew closer. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but something steadier, like the slow bloom of a flower. She was kind and patient, understanding of my hesitations. She didn't pry into my past, but she didn't shy away from it either when I chose to share. One evening, as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset, she asked, "Do you ever think about what happened with her?" "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not the way I used to. I've let go of the anger. It's not worth carrying anymore." She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "You've been through a lot. It's amazing you're still standing." "I didn't do it alone," I said, looking at her. Claire smiled, reaching for my hand. "You don't have to." By the time the anniversary of my divorce came around, my life felt entirely different. The bookstore was thriving, I had a circle of supportive friends, and Claire had become a constant presence. I thought about Emily sometimes, but only in passing. The pain she'd caused had faded, replaced by a sense of gratitude for what I'd learned through the experience. The crack she created in my life had forced me to rebuild, stronger than before. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. It took time, but I eventually stopped waking up with Emily on my mind. The bitterness I once carried, the weight of betrayal that seemed impossible to shed, slowly dissolved into something lighter. Not forgiveness, at least, not the kind you give someone else, but a forgiveness meant for myself. I forgave myself for trusting her blindly, for ignoring the signs, for clinging to a life that had already begun to crumble long before I noticed. That self-forgiveness was harder than I thought, but it was the only way forward. One day, while reorganizing the shelves at the bookstore, I found a novel that Emily had once recommended. It was tucked in a corner, forgotten, its cover creased from wear. I stood there holding it, memories flickering like old photographs. It didn't hurt as much as I expected. Instead, it felt like looking at a stranger story, something that had happened to someone else long ago. I placed the book in the donation pile without a second thought. My conversations with Claire became deeper as the weeks went on. One evening, while we cooked dinner together in my newly renovated kitchen, she asked, "Do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" I paused, considering her question. "I used to," I admitted. "I spent so much time wondering what I could have done differently, what I could have changed to keep everything from falling apart." "And now?" she asked, her voice gentle. I looked at her, the soft light from the overhead lamp highlighting her kind features. "Now I think it was a blessing in disguise. It didn't feel like it at the time, but losing Emily forced me to look at myself, at what I really wanted in life. And it led me here." Claire smiled, her hand brushing against mine as she handed me a cutting board. Sometimes the worst endings bring the best beginnings. I nodded, the truth of her words settling deep in my chest. By the following spring, my life felt almost unrecognizable. The bookstore had expanded to include a small cafe, thanks to a partnership with a local coffee roaster. It became a hub for the community, bustling with energy and laughter. Claire was a regular presence, helping me organize events and offering suggestions for new promotions. She brought a warmth to the store, and to my life, that I hadn't realized I was missing. One afternoon, as we sat in the cafe sipping lattes, Claire leaned back in her chair and looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you ever hear from her?" she asked. "Emily?" She nodded. "Not in a while," I said. "She tried to reach out a few times after the divorce, but I ignored her. There's nothing left to say." Claire didn't press further, and I appreciated that. She understood that my past was just that, past. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected email. It was from Emily. The subject line read, "For what it's worth." I hesitated before opening it. My heart didn't race the way it once would have, but a faint curiosity tugged at me. When I finally clicked it, her words were surprisingly brief. "Alex, I don't expect a response, and I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for everything. You didn't deserve what I did to you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I hope you're happy. You deserve to be." I stared at the screen for a long time. The anger I'd once felt wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance. Her apology didn't change what had happened, and it didn't erase the pain she caused. But it also didn't have the power to hurt me anymore. I closed the email without replying. That night, as Claire and I walked along a quiet trail near my house, I told her about the email. She listened without interrupting, her hand warm in mine. "Do you feel any better after hearing from her?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. "I don't know if better is the right word. It's more like closure. Like a door that was left open finally swung shut." Claire nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "That's a good thing, right?" "It is," I said, squeezing her hand gently. "It really is." For the first time in years, I felt free. Months passed, and the pieces of my life began to fall into place. The bookstore thrived, and the cafe became a beloved community hub. My days were filled with purpose, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was living instead of merely existing. Claire became an integral part of my life. She wasn't just my partner, she was my anchor. With her, everything felt simple, natural. There was no pretense, no guarded words. Our relationship was built on the very foundation Emily had shattered: trust. One evening, after closing the bookstore, we sat together on the back porch of my house, sipping wine and watching the stars. Claire rested her head on my shoulder, her presence a quiet comfort. "I love this," she said softly. "Just being here with you." I smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "Me too. I never thought I'd find this again." She lifted her head to look at me, her expression curious. "Did you think about giving up on relationships? After everything?" "For a while," I admitted. "It's hard to imagine trusting someone again after you've been betrayed like that. But meeting you—" I paused, my throat tightening slightly. "You made it easy to believe again." Claire smiled, her eyes glistening in the soft moonlight. "You made it easy for me too." In that moment, I realized how far I'd come. The bitterness and anger that had once consumed me were gone, replaced by gratitude for the new chapter one was building. One Saturday, as Claire and I prepared for an event at the bookstore, she pulled me aside with a mischievous grin. "I have an idea," she said, holding up a small, folded flyer. "What's this?" I asked, taking it from her. "An open mic night," she explained. "For people to share stories, poetry, music, Anything they want. We could host it once a month, bring in more of the community. I studied the flyer, imagining the possibilities. I like it, I said, nodding. Let's do it. The first event was a massive success. People of all ages filled the cafe, sharing their talents and connecting with each other in a way that felt electric. Watching it unfold, I couldn't help but feel proud, not just of the bookstore, but of the life I created after everything had fallen apart. A few weeks later, Claire and I took our first trip together, a weekend getaway to a cabin in the mountains. The air was crisp, the scenery breathtaking, and the quietness of the forest felt like a balm for the soul. On our second night, as we sat by the fire, Claire turned to me with a serious expression. Alex, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever think about what you want next? Like for us? Her question caught me off guard, but not in a bad way. I set my mug of coffee down and took her hand. I think about it all the time, I admitted. You've brought so much light into my life, Claire. I want to keep building this, us, for as long as you'll have me. Her face softened, and she leaned forward to kiss me. I feel the same way, she whispered. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I wouldn't face them alone. Back in town, life returned to its steady rhythm, but something had shifted. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly dream about the future, a future with Claire by my side, one built on the lessons I'd learned from my past. I didn't know where the road would lead, but I was finally ready to walk it. A year after the divorce, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The wounds Emily had left weren't entirely gone, but they had faded into scars, reminders of lessons learned, of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. Claire and I had grown closer than I ever thought possible. She didn't try to erase my past or pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, she accepted it as a part of me, and in doing so, helped me heal in ways I hadn't thought possible. One afternoon, as I was shelving books at the store, an unfamiliar customer walked in. At first, I didn't recognize her, but when she removed her sunglasses, my breath caught. It was Emily. She looked different, tired, her once polished appearance replaced by a more subdued version of herself. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to say. "Hi, Alex," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. I just wanted to see you," she admitted. "To apologize. Properly this time." I set the book I was holding on the counter and crossed my arms. "You already apologized. In that email." "I know," she said, looking down at the floor. "But I needed to say it in person. I needed to tell you how much I regret everything I did, how much I hurt you. You didn't deserve that." I studied her for a moment, searching for any trace of the woman I once knew. There was sincerity in her voice, but it no longer held the power to move me. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "But it doesn't change anything." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know. I'm glad you're doing well. You deserve to be happy, Alex." "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady. "I hope you find happiness too." She smiled faintly, wiped her eyes, and turned to leave. As the door closed behind her, I felt no anger, no sadness, just a sense of finality. That evening, I told Claire about the encounter. She listened quietly, her hand resting on mine. When I finished, she leaned in and kissed my cheek. "You handled that beautifully," she said. "I didn't feel angry," I admitted. "I thought I might, but I didn't. It just felt like closure." "Because it is," Claire said with a smile. "You've moved on, Alex. You're building something new, something better." I looked at her, the warmth in her eyes reflecting everything I'd been searching for. As the months passed, the life Claire and I built together continued to grow. We traveled, made plans for the future, and celebrated the small victories that came with simply living in the moment. One evening, as we stood on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Claire slipped her hand into mine. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" she asked. "All the time," I said, my voice filled with gratitude. "And I couldn't have done it without you." She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. "We've both come a long way, and I think the best part is still ahead." As I looked out at the horizon, the sky painted with shades of gold and orange, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Emily's betrayal had shattered me, but it also forced me to rebuild, to grow, to find strength I didn't know I had. The crack she created had let in the light, and for that, I was grateful. The future wasn't something I feared anymore. It was something I embraced, ready to shape it into something beautiful with a person who had shown me that love, trust, and hope were still possible. Because in the end, I wasn't defined by what I had lost. I was defined by what I had gained.